The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the scorching June sun, its red earth cracked like broken promises. On the San Carlos Apache reservation, poverty hung in the air as thick as the dust that coated everything: the weathered trailers, the rusted pickup trucks, and the dreams of families who had learned to survive on hope and government commodities. 8-year-old Ayanna sat cross-legged on the front steps of her grandmother's trailer, her dark eyes watching the horizon while her small fingers braided sweetgrass her grandmother had taught her to gather. The scent was supposed to bring peace, but today it couldn't mask the shouting coming from inside. "She's just another mouth to feed, Mom." Her Uncle Jake's voice cut through the thin walls like a knife. The smell of alcohol on his breath had become as familiar as the morning coffee her grandmother brewed. "The casino's been laying people off, and Sarah's kids need. She's your brother's daughter." Grandmother Rose's voice trembled with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. At 73, she had raised too many children, buried too many dreams, and watched too many of her own family members lose themselves to the bottle. Ayanna pressed her ear closer to the screen door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had learned early that when adults whispered about children, it usually meant something bad was coming. "David's been gone 3 years now," Jake continued, his words slurring together. "Dead in that car wreck, and we can't keep pretending we can take care of his kid when we can barely take care of our own." Through the gap in the door, Ayanna could see her uncle pacing the small living room, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the worn linoleum. Her Aunt Sarah sat hunched at the kitchen table, counting and recounting a small stack of crumpled bills, her face gaunt from stress and sleepless nights. "There's a family in Phoenix," Sarah said quietly, not meeting her mother-in-law's eyes. "Non-native family. They've been looking to adopt. They said they'd pay enough to cover rent for 6 months, maybe more." The sweetgrass fell from Ayanna's fingers. The Rose's voice dropped to a whisper, but in the desert silence, every word carried. "You want to sell that child like she's livestock?" "It's not selling," Jake snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. It's giving her a better life. Better than what we can give her here." Ayanna had heard these conversations before, in different forms, about different children. She knew about her cousin Marcus, who had gone to live with a nice family in Tucson when she was 6. She knew about little Maria next door, who had found a better situation in California. The adults always used gentle words, but the children understood the truth. When times got desperate enough, even family became negotiable. That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Ayanna sat with her grandmother on the front steps. Rose's weathered hands worked on a piece of beadwork, her fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of decades. "Grandmother," Ayanna said carefully, "am I going away?" Rose's hands stilled. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant call of a coyote and the hum of the neighbor's generator. "Sometimes, little one," Rose said finally, "the world gets broken. And sometimes, the people we love get broken too." She set down her beadwork and pulled Ayanna close, her embrace smelling of sage and old cotton. "But broken doesn't mean destroyed. Remember that." "I don't want to go." "I know, child. I know." The next morning, a dusty sedan with Maricopa County plates pulled up to the trailer. Ayanna watched from the window as a white couple in clean clothes spoke quietly with Jake and Sarah. The woman kept looking toward the trailer, her expression a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been guilt. Ayanna packed her few belongings in a paper grocery bag, 3 changes of clothes, the small medicine pouch her grandmother had given her, and a photograph of her father in his army uniform. As she folded her clothes, she could hear the adults discussing arrangements and compensation in the living room. When it was time to leave, Rose pulled Ayanna aside one last time. "Listen to me," she whispered, pressing something small and hard into Ayanna's palm. It was a piece of turquoise, smooth from years of handling. "This land, this family, this blood, it's all still yours, no matter where you go. No matter what papers they sign or what names they give you. You are Apache. You are Chiricahua. You are the daughter of David Running Horse, and that can never be sold." Ayanna nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She was 8 years old, and the world was too big and too complicated for her to grasp why love sometimes looked like abandonment. As the sedan pulled away from the reservation, Ayanna pressed her face to the rear window, watching her grandmother's figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely into the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. Jake stood in the trailer doorway, clutching a bottle of whiskey, payment for a transaction that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told himself it was temporary, that they'd get her back when things got better. But deep down, in the place where truth lives even when we try to bury it, he knew some choices could never be undone. The desert kept its secrets, but it also kept its promises. And as the sedan carried Ayanna toward an uncertain future, the land itself seemed to whisper a vow. Asterisk, what belongs to the earth will return to the earth. What belongs to the people will find its way home. Asterisk, 15 years had passed since Ayanna became Anna Peterson on legal documents that transformed her from an Apache girl into the adopted daughter of suburban Phoenix. The Peterson house on Camelback Road was everything the reservation wasn't. Manicured lawns, two-car garage, central air conditioning, and a refrigerator that never ran empty. But comfort came with a price that no contract had specified. "Anna, honey, we're going to be late for your interview," Margaret Peterson called from the kitchen, her voice carrying that particular strain that came from trying too hard to sound casual. She stood at the granite countertop, packing organic snacks into a designer bag, her movements precise but nervous. 23-year-old Ayanna, Anna to everyone but herself, emerged from her room in a perfectly tailored business suit, her long black hair pulled back in the kind of sleek bun that belonged in corporate boardrooms. She had learned early that success in the white world meant becoming indistinguishable from it, and she had mastered the art of camouflage. "I can drive myself," she said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. The young woman staring back looked nothing like the 8-year-old who had left the reservation with nothing but a paper bag and a piece of turquoise. This woman wore armor made of education, ambition, and carefully controlled emotions. "But it's such an important day," Margaret insisted. "Your first job interview at Morrison Development. Your father and I are so proud. I know you are." Ayanna's voice was gentle but firm. She had learned to navigate Margaret's anxieties with the same skill she brought to everything else. Careful attention to what was needed, what was expected, and what would cause the least disruption. David Peterson looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He was a kind man who had genuinely tried to be a good father, but there had always been an invisible barrier between them. The knowledge that their relationship was built on a transaction rather than biology. "Just remember," he said, "you've got every advantage now. Harvard Business School, magna cum laude, internships at 2 Fortune 500 companies. You've earned your place at that table." Ayanna nodded, but something cold settled in her stomach. Earned her place. As if she had been born without one. That the drive to downtown Phoenix took her through neighborhoods that told the story of the city's expansion, from the affluent suburbs where she'd grown up, through middle-class developments, past strip malls, and apartment complexes, to the gleaming towers of the business district. But Ayanna's mind wasn't on the changing landscape outside her BMW's windows. It was on the folder in her briefcase that contained research she had never shared with the Petersons. Morrison Development was one of Arizona's largest real estate firms, specializing in luxury resorts and residential developments. What the Petersons didn't know was that Ayanna had spent months researching the company's holdings, particularly their recent acquisition of a 15,000-acre parcel of land in southeastern Arizona, land that bordered the San Carlos Apache Reservation. The Morrison building rose 40 stories into the desert sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the mountains that ringed the valley. In the elevator ascending to the 38th floor, Ayanna caught her reflection in the polished doors. For just a moment, she allowed herself to see what she usually kept hidden, the features that no amount of professional styling could completely disguise. The bone structure that spoke of ancestors who had lived in these mountains for generations before Phoenix was even a dream. The interview went exactly as she had expected. James Morrison III, grandson of the company's founder, was a man who wore his privilege like expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakable. He sat behind a desk the size of a small car, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he helped shape. "Impressive resume, Miss Peterson," he said, though his tone suggested he was already convinced. "Harvard Business School, top of your class, excellent references." We could use someone with your background in our acquisitions department. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'm particularly interested in your southwestern development projects. Ayanna kept her voice level, professional. I understand you've recently acquired significant acreage in Cochise County. Morrison's eyes lit up. Ah, you've done your homework. Yes, that's going to be our crown jewel, Desert Vista Estates. Luxury homes starting at $2 million. Golf course designed by Robert Trent Jones Jr., spa resort, the works. It's going to transform that entire region. Ayanna nodded thoughtfully. The land has quite a history, doesn't it? Well, it's been undeveloped for decades. Cattle ranching, some mining claims that never panned out. Nothing significant. Morrison waved his hand dismissively. The important thing is its potential. Views of the Dragoon Mountains, pristine desert landscape, and close enough to Tucson to attract serious buyers. What he didn't mention, what Ayanna had discovered through weeks of research, was that the land had been sacred to the Chiricahua Apache for centuries. It contained burial sites, ceremonial grounds, and water sources that had sustained her. People long before the first Europeans set foot in North America. It had been taken through a series of dubious legal maneuvers in the 1920s, sold and resold until its original significance was buried under layers of property deeds and zoning regulations. When would you like to start? Morrison asked, clearly, ready to conclude the interview. Immediately, Ayanna replied, I have some ideas about the project that I think you'll find very interesting. That evening, Ayanna sat in her apartment in Scottsdale, a sleek, modern space that could have been featured in Architectural Digest. She had bought it with money from her trust fund, another gift from the Petersons that came with invisible strings attached. The walls were decorated with contemporary art that said nothing about who she really was, and the bookshelves held business texts and leadership manuals that had helped her build her professional persona. But in her bedroom, hidden in a jewelry box that Margaret had given her for high school graduation, was the piece of turquoise her grandmother had pressed into her palm 15 years ago. She held it now, feeling its smooth warmth against her skin. Her laptop was open on the bed beside her, displaying property records, environmental surveys, and geological reports for the Morrison acquisition. But there was another folder on her desktop, one she had been building for years. Genealogical records, tribal enrollment documents, and historical accounts of her family's connection to the land Morrison planned to develop. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. How did the interview go, sweetheart? Dad and I are dying to hear. Ayanna typed back, got the job. Start Monday. What she didn't tell them was that getting the job had never been in question. She had orchestrated every step of the process, from choosing her college major to building the exact resume Morrison Development would find irresistible. She had spent 15 years becoming exactly the person they would want to hire, because sometimes the best way to destroy a system was from the inside. As she sat in her expensive apartment, surrounded by all the symbols of her success in the white world, Ayanna allowed herself to remember something else her grandmother had told her that last day on the reservation. The earth is patient, little one. It waits for what belongs to it to come home. Tomorrow, she would begin her new job at Morrison Development. Tomorrow, she would start the process of coming home. 6 months into her position at Morrison Development, Ayanna had become indispensable. She worked longer hours than anyone else in acquisitions, produced more detailed market analyses, and had successfully negotiated 3 major property deals that had netted the company millions in profit. James Morrison III had taken to introducing her as his rising star, and there was already talk of a promotion. What Morrison didn't know was that every late night Ayanna spent in the office, every weekend she claimed to be working on market research, she was actually building something else entirely. The Morrison building emptied out after 6 p.m., leaving only security guards and the occasional executive pulling an all-nighter. Ayanna had learned the rhythms of the place, knew exactly when she could move through the halls without attracting attention. Tonight, she made her way to the 39th floor, where the company's legal department kept its files. Her keycard, upgraded 6 weeks ago when Morrison had given her access to sensitive projects, opened the door with a soft beep. Inside, rows of filing cabinets contained the paper trail of Morrison Development's 40-year history of land acquisition and development throughout Arizona. Ayanna went directly to the files she needed, the complete documentation of the Cochise County purchase. What she found there made her hands shake with anger she had spent 15 years learning to control. The land Morrison had acquired for Desert Vista Estates wasn't just sacred Apache territory. It was land that had been illegally taken from her own family. The documents told a story of systematic theft spanning 3 generations. In 1924, her great-great-grandfather, Samuel Running Horse, had been granted title to 2,000 acres under the Dawes Act, a federal program that had parceled out reservation land to individual native families. Samuel had built a ranch there, raised cattle, and established a small but thriving operation that supported his extended family. But in 1931, during the depths of the Great Depression, a combination of drought, falling cattle prices, and predatory lending had forced Samuel into debt. A Phoenix bank had foreclosed on the property, selling it to a mining company for a fraction of its value. The mining company had sold it to a cattle rancher, who had sold it to a development company, which had sold it to Morrison Development. Each transaction had been perfectly legal, but the original taking had been built on a foundation of economic coercion and cultural destruction. The land that Morrison planned to turn into million-dollar vacation homes had been stolen from her family. Ayanna photographed every document with her phone, her hands steady despite the rage burning in her chest. She had suspected the connection, but seeing it documented in black and white made it real in a way that threatened to shatter the careful control she had built around her emotions. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had been caught, but it was just Margaret. Haven't heard from you in a few days, honey. Everything okay? Ayanna typed back. Just busy with work. Love you. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did love the Petersons in the complicated way you could love people who had saved you and damaged you at the same time. They had given her education, opportunity, and a life free from the poverty that had consumed her biological family. But they had also required her to become someone else entirely, to bury the part of herself that belonged to the desert and the people who had shaped the woman she was meant to be. The next morning, Ayanna sat in Morrison's office for their weekly project update, the stolen documents feeling like they were burning a hole in her briefcase. The environmental surveys for Desert Vista are coming along nicely, Morrison was saying, leaning back in his leather chair. We should be ready to break ground by spring. Actually, Ayanna said carefully, I've been researching the property's history, and I think we might want to slow down the timeline. Morrison frowned. Why? The permits are all in order, the financing is locked in, there might be some cultural sensitivity issues we need to address. Ayanna kept her voice neutral. Professional. The land has historical significance to local Apache tribes. If that becomes public knowledge during development, it could create complications. What kind of complications? Protests, negative media coverage, potential legal challenges. You know how these things can snowball in today's climate. Ayanna opened her laptop and pulled up a presentation she had prepared. I think our best strategy is to get ahead of any potential issues by conducting a thorough historical assessment. Morrison studied the slides she showed him, carefully selected examples of other development projects that had been derailed by cultural preservation concerns. She had spent weeks researching similar cases, building a compelling argument for why Morrison Development should be cautious. How long would this assessment take? Morrison asked. 6 months, maybe 8. But it's better to spend that time now than face years of legal challenges later. Morrison nodded slowly. I hate delays, but you make a good point. Set up a meeting with our legal team. Let's see what they think. As Ayanna left Morrison's office, she felt a small thrill of victory. She had just bought herself time to research the legal precedents that might allow her to challenge Morrison's ownership of the land, time to build a case that could stand up in court, and time to figure out how to reclaim what had been stolen from her family. That weekend, Ayanna drove southeast from Phoenix, following highways that led away from the city's sprawl and into the raw beauty of the Sonoran Desert. She hadn't been back to the San Carlos reservation since the day she had left 15 years ago, but today felt different. Today, she was returning not as the abandoned child who had been sold for a bottle of whiskey, but as a woman with the power to fight back. The reservation looked exactly as she remembered and completely different. At the same time, the poverty was still there, the trailers, the unemployment, the weight of generations of systematic oppression. But there was also something else. Solar panels on some of the buildings, a new community center, signs of a people who had refused to disappear despite everything that had been done to them. She found her grandmother's trailer by memory, driving slowly through streets that had no names but felt like home in a way that her Scottsdale apartment never could. The trailer was smaller than she remembered, more weathered, but there was still a garden in front where someone was growing traditional plants. Rose Running Horse was 88 now, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled with arthritis. But her eyes were still sharp, still fierce, and when she saw Ayanna walking up the path to her door, she showed no surprise. "I wondered when you would come back," she said simply. They sat together on the front steps where Ayanna had spent her last morning 15 years ago, drinking coffee from chipped mugs while the desert spread out before them like an ancient prayer. "I need to know about the land," Ayanna said. "About Samuel Running Horse, about what we lost." Rose nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about that. Your great-great-grandfather, he never got over losing that place. It killed him. Losing the ranch broke his heart and his spirit. I want to get it back." Rose studied her granddaughter's face. Older now, marked by years in a world that had tried to make her forget who she was, but still carrying something that belonged to the desert and the people who had called it home for centuries. "How?" Rose asked. Ayanna smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, it was a smile that belonged entirely to the Apache girl who had never really gone away. "I'm going to buy it." The conference room on the 40th floor of the Morrison building buzzed with tension as Ayanna spread documents across the polished mahogany table. 18 months had passed since she had first walked into James Morrison's office as a job applicant. Now, she sat across from him as the majority shareholder of Morrison Development. "I don't understand how this happened," Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. His lawyer, accountant, and senior partners flanked him, all wearing expressions of professional bewilderment. Ayanna adjusted the sleeve of her tailored jacket, Apache turquoise cufflinks gleaming at her wrists, and smiled calmly. "It's actually quite straightforward, James. Over the past year, I've been quietly purchasing shares of Morrison Development through a network of investment funds and holding companies. As of yesterday's market close, I control 51% of your company's stock." The hostile takeover had been elegant in its simplicity. Using connections she had built during her years at Harvard Business School and her subsequent work in corporate acquisitions, Ayanna had assembled a coalition of investors, many of them Native American entrepreneurs and tribal enterprise funds, to systematically purchase Morrison Development stock. The purchases had been small enough to avoid triggering disclosure requirements, spread across enough different entities to remain invisible until it was too late. "This is corporate warfare," Morrison snapped. "I'll fight this in court. On what grounds?" Ayanna's voice remained perfectly level. Every purchase was legal, properly documented, and conducted through legitimate financial institutions. "Your own lawyers can confirm that." She gestured to the stack of documents before them. "I've spent the last 6 months having every transaction reviewed by 3 different law firms. You'll find everything is in perfect order." Morrison's lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Henley who had built her reputation on hostile takeover defense, leaned forward. "Ms. Peterson, what exactly do you want?" "If this is about a severance package or some kind of employment dispute, this isn't about money," Ayanna interrupted. "Though I should mention, as the majority shareholder, I'll be making some significant changes to the company's direction, starting with the immediate cancellation of the Desert Vista Estates project." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Phoenix traffic 40 floors below. "You can't do that," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We have millions invested in that project. The permits alone cost the company $2.3 million, according to your own accounting." "Yes, I'm aware." Ayanna opened her briefcase and withdrew another set of documents. "I'm also aware that the land Morrison Development acquired for Desert Vista was stolen from my family in 1931. She slid copies of the historical documents across the table, the same records she had photographed in the company's own files, supplemented by tribal records, federal land office documents, and genealogical evidence that established her direct descent from Samuel Running Horse. "The original foreclosure was legal under the laws of the time," she continued, "but it was part of a systematic campaign to dispossess Native families of their land. What's interesting is that under current federal law, specifically the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, there are grounds to challenge developments on land that contains significant cultural sites. Patricia Henley scanned the documents, her expression growing increasingly grim. You're threatening to tie up the project in federal court. I'm not threatening anything. I'm simply explaining why, as the new majority owner of Morrison Development, I've decided to cancel a project that would have been legally and financially disastrous for the company. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his face flushed with anger, and something that might have been admiration. You planned this from the beginning. The job application, the stellar performance reviews, gaining access to our files. It was all part of some elaborate revenge scheme. For the first time in the meeting, Ayana's professional composure cracked slightly. Revenge would have been exposing your company's history of profiting from stolen native land to every major media outlet in the Southwest. Revenge would have been organizing protests and boycotts that would have made it impossible for you to operate in Arizona. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city where she had spent 15 years learning to become someone else. This isn't revenge, James. This is justice, and it's business. When she turned back to face the room, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, the authority of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly who she was meant to be. The land that Morrison Development owns in Cochise County will be donated to the San Carlos Apache tribe to be held in trust for future generations. The company will refocus its efforts on sustainable development projects that benefit local communities rather than displacing them. And we'll establish a foundation to support Native American entrepreneurs and students pursuing careers in business and law. Morrison's shoulders sagged in defeat. And if we refuse to go along with your vision, then I'll exercise my rights as majority shareholder to replace the entire board of directors and senior management team. Ayana's smile was sharp as desert wind. But I prefer to work with people who understand that the future of development in the Southwest depends on partnerships with indigenous communities, not the continued exploitation of them. 3 months later, Ayana stood on the land that had once belonged to her great-great-grandfather, watching as bulldozers cleared away the survey stakes and temporary roads that Morrison Development had installed in preparation for Desert Vista Estates. The Dragoon Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks purple in the late afternoon light, and the desert stretched away in all directions like a sea of possibility. Rose's running horse sat in a folding chair nearby, her weathered hands working on a piece of beadwork while she supervised the restoration work. At 90, she moved slowly but with the same fierce determination that had sustained her through 9 decades of a hard life. Your great-great-grandfather would be proud, she said without looking up from her beadwork. He never stopped believing. This land would come home to us someday. Ayana knelt beside her grandmother's chair and placed her hand on the red earth, soil that carried the footprints of her ancestors, the memories of generations who had called this place home. I've been thinking, she said, about names, about who I really am. Rose nodded. Anna Peterson served her purpose, but that was never your real name. Ayana Running Horse. The name felt strange on her tongue after so many years of being someone else, but it also felt like coming back to life after a long sleep. Your father chose that name, Rose said. It means eternal blossom in our language. He said you would grow into something beautiful no matter what kind of ground you were planted in. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no photograph could capture, Ayana thought about the journey that had brought her here. The 8-year-old girl who had been sold for a bottle of whiskey had become a woman who owned millions of dollars in real estate and controlled one of Arizona's largest development companies. But more than that, she had become someone who understood. That power without purpose was just another form of emptiness. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Peterson. Saw the news story about your takeover of Morrison Development. Dad and I are so proud of you, even if we don't completely understand what you're doing. Love you always. Ayana typed back, love you too. I'll call you this weekend and explain everything. The Petersons had given her the tools she needed to fight for her people's land, even if that hadn't been their intention. Her Harvard MBA, her understanding of corporate finance, her network of business contacts, all of it had been necessary for this moment. She could be grateful for their love while also acknowledging that love alone hadn't been enough to heal the wound of being separated from her culture and her people. As darkness fell over the desert, Ayana walked the land that was finally home. Again, her footsteps following paths that her ancestors had worn into the earth centuries before Phoenix existed, before Arizona was a state, before anyone had imagined that a people's connection to their homeland could be bought and sold like a commodity. The land was patient, her grandmother had told her. It waited for what belonged to it to come home. Now she understood what that meant. Some things, family, culture, the deep knowledge of who you are and where you come from, couldn't be taken, no matter how much money changed hands or how many legal documents were signed. They could only be buried, hidden, forgotten for a while. But they never really went away. They just waited, like seeds in the desert, for the right conditions to bloom again. The Apache girl who had been sold for a bottle of whiskey was finally home, and she had brought the land with her.